Hello. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I know this is the kind of year where I would be busy tonight, so thank you for being here. I am someone who's been interested in what we're going to be talking about for a long time, and I'm interested in two levels. I'm interested as in my career, which I'll tell you about in a moment, but I'm also interested as anyone who lives on this planet should be interested. I'm interested as a living being on this planet that's threatened right now. I'm interested as a member of human civilization that's threatened right now. That's the stuff that interests me, and I'll tell you a little bit about my background. So I do a number of things. What I've been doing mainly for the last 20 years is running the World Technology Network, which is a global association of the peer-elected, most innovative people in science and technology and related fields all over the planet. We do the World Technology Awards every year. We have about 1,500 elected fellows in 20 different categories, anything you can imagine, ranging from Elon Musk to Nobel Prize winners to people who will be. Prior to that, a long time ago, when I was in my early 20s, I was Bill Clinton's liaison to the nonprofit sector when he decided to run for president a long time ago. And then I also set up one of the first internet consulting companies about a year before the web and got very involved in that world, particularly how to make a difference using new technologies. I also do, in the last few years, a lot of political work as well because of the political crisis that we face not only in America, but globally, things that are threats to democracy. And I believe that the threat to democracy is not completely unrelated right now to the threat to the planet. And tonight we'll explore some of the ways you can see how that might be true. The environment. One of the categories for the World Technology Network is the World Technology. We give out the World Technology Award for energy, and we also have the World Technology Award for the environment. So I've worked over the last 20 years with some of the top innovators in those fields. I've also organized 2 World Energy Technology Summits, one in 2004 at UNESCO headquarters in Paris in partnership with the UN, which was the first large-scale gathering of leaders in renewable energy around the world in the UN context. I did another version of that in 2010 in partnership with Time Magazine called Reality Check, where we got the heads of most of the renewable energy associations in the world together for a day to talk about who's going to do what, by when. So I'm committed to this. I'm interested in this. And at the same time as I believe we're in a dire situation, I also have been exposed to people who are doing something about it. Even if the situation is not going to play out fully positively, and there's a very good chance they may not happen, what do you do in those circumstances? You do something. So I want to frame the discussion today with a simple idea. Imagine that I told you that there was an asteroid heading to Earth, and it was going to arrive sometime in the next 10 to 20 years. And it was at the very least going to be civilization altering, and it might be much worse. What would we do as a civilization, as a society, as a species? What would we do in the face of that threat? Would we pat ourselves on the back for coming up with a strategy that dealt with a little bit of the asteroid? We wouldn't, except that's what we're doing. Most of us, most of society. And we're feeling a little less anxious every time we hear about a small-scale project or a project that's going to take 2 to 3 decades to play out. But again, remember, the asteroid's going to hit into 10 to 20 years. So I also believe that it is unethical in our personal lives, in our professional lives, in our human civilizational lives to seek solutions to a problem that aren't up to the scale of the problem. That's unethical if it's knowing. right? If you're aware that that's true. So we need mass scale solutions to this mass scale challenge that we're facing. And this evening, we're going to talk about some of them. So before we go further, I would like to introduce my companion here up on the couch, Stefan Nicoleau, who's going to talk a little bit about his background, and then we're going to go into what's the situation that we face right now before we start talking about some solutions. So thank you all for being here, and Stefan, over to you. Tell us about yourself.
Thank you, Jim. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out on a cool but not too cold Monday. Much appreciated. I've got some colleagues here that tell me that when I speak with a microphone, I do a Jack Donaghy kind of voice, and they make fun of me. And so if I start to do that, please stop me. My name is Stephan Nicoleau. I'm the Managing Director of FullCycle. FullCycle is an investment firm that is poised and targeted towards investing in technology that will help us to slow, stem, and reverse climate change. So no small order, no small task at hand, but something that we're committed to because, as Jim says, there's a moral imperative, but we also believe that this is the greatest opportunity for humanity to come together, create stakeholders, and change the course of what will happen on this planet. It will take many of us to do so, and we'll talk about what that looks like for us. By way of background, I too am a member of humanity. And I'm a New Yorker. I'm a finance professional of 15 years. I've worked at some of the bigger institutions, JP Morgan, Credit Suisse, Deutsche Bank. I've worked on the buy side for some of the larger family offices. And in the course of my career, one of the things that has always stuck out to me is that when we think about how we invest, how we deploy resources, we oftentimes leave out some of the most critical questions that we should be asking about what will impact those investments. I think today we see the effects of climate change affecting everything and sparing no one. If you have a house or had a house in Malibu, that makes sense to you, right? There's no escaping the effects of climate change. So if you are an active investor, or if you're just a regular person who has a 401k, believe it or not, you are invested in opportunities, in companies, in projects that could be made better, that should address the issues at hand, and in fact are impacted by climate change, whether you like it or not. So this is a problem that affects everyone. And it's one of those things where, you can go through your daily life and know that there's something urgent and tremendous coming our way, but not know what to do with it, or what to do about it. And for us at FullCycle, I'll go through what we're about in a moment, but one of the most important pieces is that as urgent as the issue is, we are not alarmists, right? When people are alarmed, they get anxious, they shut down. They don't know what to do. And what we're oriented towards are solutions, real, practical, applicable solutions that we all can participate in to start to save our planet, to stem this problem. So for FullCycle, the principle at hand is there are three principles at hand. The first is, for anyone here who is an investor or maybe has $1 or $2 in savings, I will say, who cares? Who cares how much money we make on a planet that's dying, right? What does it matter? I think another principle would be, who cares how much money we make if people around us are suffering? Because climate change doesn't impact everyone equally, right? So for us, we're focused on finding solutions that we can bring to market fast, efficiently, cost effectively, and that will have a real impact on what happens on planet Earth. Like I said, no small order, no small task, but it is something that is achievable if we orient ourselves towards the problem in the right way. So that's who I am. That's what we're doing. The situation is something to be described and looked at accurately, and I think with eyes wide open. It's a big problem, but it is one that we can solve.
What is the situation?
Thanks, Jim.
How bad is it?
Thanks, Jim. Like I said, we're not alarmists, but actually, since it's a small audience, by a show of hands, how many folks have read or heard about the IPCC report on climate change that came out a few months ago, or about the United States government climate assessment that came out just a few weeks ago? So we know the problem's big, right? Let's put it into numbers. Let's put some kind of parameters around it so we can really understand. Right now, we are on a trajectory of increasing the temperature of our climate by 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050. That doesn't sound like very much. If you turn your thermostat up 1.5 degrees Celsius, it's not the difference between wearing a sweater or a t-shirt in your home. But for the planet, the impact of that 1.5 degrees is pretty terrible. If we hurtle towards 2 degrees, right? So if the problem accelerates, if indeed the inputs into the problem, industry, agriculture, our consumer practices accelerate by any measure, 2 degrees is a world that we don't want to live in, right? It's a world where the sea level rises 2.5 feet, right? And that sea level rise will mean that Lower Manhattan is underwater. Anyone live in Lower Manhattan? Near Lower Manhattan? You're going to have to move, right? Miami Beach, underwater. Netherlands, underwater. New Orleans, underwater. So that's not a world we want to live in, because that changing coastline creates tremendous instability. There's an economic argument that we should hear as well, that you don't want to lose that property, that value. You don't want to create climate refugees. And speaking of climate refugees, if we are on this trajectory and don't do anything to reverse it, that's hundreds of millions of people who have to go somewhere, just from changing coastlines alone. To give you perspective, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, 1 million refugees flowing into the EU almost collapsed the EU. 100 million climate refugees going to higher, drier ground will be catastrophic. So we need to do something. Droughts. Anyone from or hail from or live in California? South Africa? Earlier this year, Cape Town almost hit day 0. What that means is that no more fresh water, no more tap water coming out of the tap. That's something we take, I think, for granted. You turn on the tap, water will come out. It's clean, it's potable, you can drink it. That wasn't the case in South Africa. And it was only through a Herculean effort, a collective effort, and some pure dumb luck in the form of rainwater that Cape Town was able to avert day 0 by a couple of months. It's now on hold temporarily. And similar cities and other cities will face a similar situation. Sao Paulo, Mexico City, maybe even New York, Los Angeles. So we're talking about impact at a broad scale that no one person or one government can stop without it being a much larger effort. And then lastly, we talk about people suffering, human disease, malaria, yellow fever, mosquito-borne illnesses. All of those at 1.5 degrees temperature rise increase by 25% or more. So there are thousands of arguments. We're going to go through a lot of them. We're going to miss many of them because we only have an hour to talk with each other. But those are some of the circumstances at which 2050 doesn't look so pretty for all of us. And so there is a moral calling, there is a collective calling for us to do something about this trajectory. But as I said earlier, the solutions are not out of our reach. They are attainable. We just have to be focused on this issue as a precedent issue to anything else that you might care about. There's a great Carl Sagan quote that points to that. that says this is the thing we have to focus on, because anything else that you do doesn't matter if the planet is uninhabitable. And we really take that to heart in everything that we do. So the situation is urgent, not dire. The solutions are attainable, but we have to go get them. And we've got to be collectively focused on that.
Thank you. I feel much better already. Now you see why I think it's like an asteroid heading to Earth. And I do think, I will disagree with you and say that I think the situation is dire if we do nothing or do insufficient things. But I actually think it's not dire because we actually know what we could do that could change things. And I also think it's not dire because actually there's a heck of a lot going on around the world right now by people and governments that have realized the scale of the situation. The American government, current American government, hasn't realized or doesn't want to realize or is in the thrall of interests that don't want to realize the scale of the situation, but almost every other country on Earth has. And that's proof that it can happen. And the change in policies from those governments and the cultures around the world is proof that it can happen. So as much as the U.S. is a big contributor to the problem, it is not going to stop the world from trying to solve the problem. And soon enough, we'll be joining them. So there are some issues that aren't mass scale projects that the private sector or public-private partnerships or the public sector, all these things we're going to talk about are that we're facing. One of them has to do with the public messaging. Like why isn't this sinking in fully the way an asteroid would if we knew it was coming? And secondly, how are we going to pay for all this stuff? So first, let's talk about what you think. Let's have a conversation. I do want to mention that we're going to do Q&A, by the way. So keep in mind, if anything strikes your interest, make a mental note and remember to come back to it during the Q&A. So first of all, why do you think you go out and you pitch investors into the fund, and some people get it immediately? Other people seem to resist. Also, you've probably made pitches where the pitch, it seems so self-evident that you cannot imagine someone not responding to it. And yet many people don't respond to it. So why do you think, let's talk a little bit about why it's not sinking into everyone yet, the scale of this crisis?
I mean, I think in part, sometimes it's just hard to see the forest through the trees, right? And we live kind of busy, myopic lives of the problems that we face every day right in front of us, and maybe aren't thinking about 2050, right? I don't know where I'll be in 2050. So I think that's one piece of it. I think the other problem is that it's such a massive issue, and it's such a massive prospect to undertake addressing the issue that no single investor can deploy, the capital necessary to perceivably have an impact, right? It is going to take a collective effort. And so that's part of our drive, for us is be part of a new group of stakeholders. I had someone once described to me what is necessary, and they said it's all hands on deck. I thought about it for a second. And I said, no, it's not all hands on deck. It's new hands on deck. It's more hands on deck. It's a broader deck. It's a deeper ship. It's more ships. Stick with the analogy, right? That's actually what it is. All hands on deck means the same participants, the same funders, the same governments and agencies deploying the same minuscule amounts of capital to put a Band-Aid on something that's actually a systemic issue. And so I think that level of thinking is sometimes difficult to get at the outset. But we are in a different time today than I think we were a year ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago. where we see the acute effects of climate change, and we know that the problems are real and that they're here, they're present. And if you read the reports that have come out from thousands of scientists, they tell us that we have a window of time in which to affect that problem, in which to be part of the solution. So, the key here is, well, what can you do in that window of time? This is not a, let's go out and invest in venture-related opportunities that are in a lab, right? That'll take 20 years to get to market. By 20 years, it's too late. We've missed our window of time. So the urgency is now, the opportunity is very large. And so our principle is that, it takes public-private partnerships, it takes governments, it takes private enterprise, it takes new means of financing, it takes new participants to the problem, it takes a global community of stakeholders, the likes of which humanity has never built before. No big deal. But it is achievable.
Thank you. On that topic of messaging, and I take some comfort in the fact that repeatedly we see in history the speed in which the public mindset can shift quite noticeably. There are many social issues, particularly in America, that everyone thought no one's ever going to budge on that, and the country is in a stalemate. And then we've seen very quickly a change in the public mindset. Something that was fringe and considered to be associated with fringe people becomes not so fringe, eventually becomes tolerable to the majority, eventually becomes embraced by the majority, and then becomes seen as so normal that we don't even notice it anymore. And those things can happen over a decade or less. We've seen that repeatedly in history. So I think that we're probably not going to see, there's probably, we don't even need to, and I don't think it will be that we have a series of actions that change the public mindset that humans will take to wake everyone up, right? We're having this feeling, what can we do to wake people up? I think it's actually going to happen anyway. And it's going to happen in that pattern. And we're probably going to, and I think it's been happening the last few years, where people who were adamantly against something related to the environment because they associate it as a fringe activity or a fringe subculture have managed to save face by pretending they were never against it in the first place. I think that's more normal. That's human nature. And I think that's what we can expect. And I think that's a good thing. The only way we're going to get more hands on deck and a bigger deck and a deeper boat and more boats is if we allow that to happen and we don't rub it in people's faces. So that implies that we don't take the approach that we need to wake people up. I think they are waking up. Yeah. On the topic of money, you talked about deploying capital. How much per year is the world going to need, and how much are we spending right now?
Yeah. So if you go by the data and the science, and you price out the solutions that are market ready and in the market currently, the number is $1 trillion per year, every year, compounding until 2050.
So not much.
Not much. No big deal. That number is actually a low ball, because what it assumes is that you have 100% efficiency, that you have no failures, that you don't have slippage, that you don't have governments that are inefficient in their operations. The number is actually much larger.
And we start now, because won't the costs go up if we delay the start?
That's right. So the current amount that we're spending collectively, every government, every private enterprise, every fund, every intergovernmental agency, everyone, is $300 billion for this year. So we're short considerably. And that's why we say, this is not going to be bring your standard solutions, but more standard solutions to the table, and let's see if we could tackle this thing. It is going to take some innovation. It's going to take financial innovation. It's going to take a broader community of stakeholders and investors. It's going to take a real focused effort on the part of governments and private enterprise to work together in order to find the solutions that work. Here's an example.
Actually, before you do that, can I just ask a quick
sure.
fact question? How big is the global economy every year? In other words, how much is being spent on everything anyway? Is it like a 20-something trillion or something like that, if I remember?
Well, I think it's far larger because the U.S. GDP is about 20 trillion.
Okay, that's where I heard that number.
Yeah.
Sorry. So the fact that it's far larger, and I believe the U.S. is 30-40% of the global economy, so we can do the math on that. The fact is that 1 trillion in that global economy suddenly doesn't seem insurmountable, right? It does if you just say 1 trillion. But if you say 1 trillion out of 50, 60 trillion a year, then I think that's doable.
Yeah. I think the key here is think about what we spend in industries that are contributing to climate change. Think about the infrastructure that we put in place for industries that contribute to climate change to be enabled to grow and to scale. I'm talking about oil and gas. I'm talking about major logistics. I'm talking about fast fashion. I'm talking about agriculture, things that are needed for humanity, for 7.5 billion people to live and to eat and to be clothed and to get on a plane to go places for commerce. But we do support industry to a level at which it can operate at that scale, right? That's many trillions of dollars. So a redirecting of resources is actually what we're talking about. But that will take, I don't know, some global accord, maybe cast in a city like Paris, signed by many governments.
When's that?
I don't know. And maybe the main signatory should be a government like the United States of America, right? The largest economy in the world.
Thank you. Before we talk a little bit about or go in depth with one example of a solution, if you bear with me, I wanted to run through, this may overwhelm you a little bit, but that's kind of the point. I want to run through some of the top contributors to global warming and the kinds of things that people are doing to address them, or just to put it in context a little bit. We will talk in much more detail about, someone's calling me right now. They sensed that. It's probably the Trump White House saying, don't tell them what's going on. So this is part of a list that a group called Drawdown has built. It was originally started by Paul Hawken. And they're doing a lot of amazing work, not in solving the problems themselves, not in developing the actual plans, but in chronicling and rating what in order makes the biggest difference, right? And that gives you a clue about where the mass scale initiatives should occur pretty directly. But I'm going to give you this is in order, some of the top 10. Refrigerant management, number 1. So in October 2016 in Kigali, Rwanda, the nations of the world got together and made an amendment to the Montreal Protocol that the world will phase out HFCs. That's the number 1 thing right now on their list that they believe can make a difference. Let me explain what that is. So HFCs were like CFCs that, remember when we had the ozone layer problem and we got rid of aerosol sprays? Those are related to this. It turns out that those are 1,000 to 9,000 times greater capacity to warm the atmosphere than carbon dioxide. Methane's 4 times. So in Kigali, they all agreed to start phasing these out, starting with high-income countries in 2019, low-income countries in 2024, and others in 2028. The substitutes are already on the market. So there's a clear pathway to make this change. And other than the fact that we have to figure out how to recover the old refrigeration systems and not have it leak, which is its own challenge, but also an opportunity, this was ranked as number 1. So when you think about despair, there's nothing we can do, and so on and so forth, in 2016, the world got together and said, here's the biggest thing we can do right now. And that's happening. And it will happen. The second biggest thing is wind turbines. Onshore particularly, but also to some extent offshore. So right now it's 3 to 4% of the world's electricity, and it's on a path to get to 21.6% by 2050. So we're going to live in a world on the current path that we're on right now, that if we keep doing the changes and the growth, we're going to get to over 20% of the world's electricity from wind power. That's very good news. What it leaves out, by the way, is innovation. So there's a very good chance, based on past track record, that some breakthroughs will occur that'll make that process way more efficient. So again, I'm going to run down this list. I just want to mention. So we have refrigerant management, wind turbines. Reduce food waste is number 3. A third of the food raised and prepared does not make it from farm or factory to fork. Interestingly enough, a huge part of the greenhouse gases are from the piles of rotting food that we throw away. So it's not just all that food that we waste. We're generating this thing that's 4 times worse than CO2 when we make all these garbage piles, waste piles of the food we don't use. Food waste is currently responsible for 8% of global emissions. Plant-rich diet. The meat-centric Western diet is actually on the rise globally. One of the things that people do when they start to make it out of poverty, one of the surprising downsides of global development, and huge strides have been made in the last 20 years in bringing people out of absolute deep poverty, is they want to imitate the Western lifestyle. And the Western lifestyle includes having meat much more often. So that's on the rise. Just to give you an idea, if cattle were their own nation, they would be the world's 3rd largest emitter of greenhouse gases. So literally the most effective way that an individual, we're not talking about the deploying of investment capital and public-private partnerships, the best way that an individual can contribute to the solution is to switch to either a vegan or vegetarian diet. And that's number 3 on this list.
So Jim, if I could stop you there.
Yeah.
2 things that everyone should know. The first is your average quarter pounder. If you had an unhealthy lunch today, you had a quarter pounder, maybe with cheese, that little bit of meat took 15,000 liters of water to produce. Your cup of coffee, 1,400 liters of water to produce. So we'll talk about water in a moment, but those statistics, especially about meat, are pretty jarring. And it is something that we all can do to slow the effects.
And it just reminds us, in a particularly jarring way, how lifestyle is a big contributor to all of this. We pat ourselves on the back. Remember I said in the beginning, we're patting ourselves on the back for addressing a little bit of the asteroid problem. We're patting ourselves on the back for doing some environmental things in our personal lives, but we're not doing the ones that would make the biggest difference because we have chosen not to right now, and we don't want to think about it. And why? Because it's our lifestyle. So basically everyone's hope, and I don't mean to sound cynical here, and I'm definitely not a cynical person, but everyone's hope is that all these other plans that we're going to talk about tonight are going to solve these problems without altering our lifestyle, right? Solve all these problems without having us get on jets less often to go to environmental conferences, So we're hoping that someone else is going to make a difference. So tropical forests, they once blanketed 12% of the world's landmass. They now cover just 5%. Now, having said that, people don't know this story, but a huge amount of reforestation has been happening. So Again, I won't go into detail. I'm going to run very quickly through these, but huge amount. That number is in many places around the world declining. The deforestation. We're actually reforesting. Another one that may be surprising to you, or it may seem like not a technical solution, educating girls makes a huge difference. And why does it make a huge difference? Smaller families, less population growth. So whenever we talk about these problems, we talk about human civilization impacting the planet and individual lifestyles impacting the planet. You got to multiply that by each person on the planet. And if we're not stemming and addressing the population problem, then we're going to be going 3 steps forward and maybe 4 steps back, or 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, still steps back. So we need to realize that one of the simplest things we can do is to educate girls so that when they grow up and become women, they say, I'm aware of the role I can play and I feel secure enough so that I don't need to have as many children. Another one is solar farms. So solar farms are basically it's like a power plant, but with solar arrays. So we're starting to see these. They can be on military bases, they can be in deserts, but that's the 7th most impactful thing that we can do in this coming period. Who has heard of silvopasture? One person. I hadn't. So the 8th most important thing is growing trees in the places where cattle go to pasture. So it's an ancient practice, and it sequesters 5 to 10 times as much carbon as just a field with the cattle grazing. It's a lot of effort, but it's a lot of effort in places where maybe the other tools aren't available. And this is part of the plan. Rooftop solar. If there's one thing that human civilization has right now, having covered a huge part of the earth, which is often seen as a negative, as we've created these flat surfaces underneath the sun that we can cover with solar panels. And in some countries, they're really making great strides in that. These are a little bit further down the list. I'm just going to mention a few. Geothermal. The heat energy contained below the Earth's surface is about 100 billion times more than the current world energy consumption. So geothermal, by definition, is reliable, abundant, and efficient. It takes drilling, but once you do that, the heat source, the energy source, is free. 39 countries in the world could supply 100% of their electricity needs from geothermal energy alone. And so far, about 6 to 7% of that energy has been tapped. Nuclear energy, it's 11% right now of the world's energy consumption without contributing to global warming. It has other downsides, as we know, when things go awry. So a lot of people call that the regret solution. So we shouldn't rule it out of hand. It's playing a huge role right now. It's a big chunk that isn't contributing to global warming. And that's nuclear fission energy. There's a lot of research right now about nuclear fusion energy, and that could be a game changer without having some of the downsides. And then I want to mention again, just to illustrate how mundane some of these things could be, is alternative cement. 5 to 6% of the global greenhouse gases annually come from cement, making cement. The Portland cement, which is the standard kind of cement, it's heated and the limestone's calcium splits into calcium oxide, which is the desired lime content, and carbon dioxide, which is the waste of making it. Decarbonizing limestone causes 60% of cement emissions. So the crucial strategy is to change the composition of cement. And the good news is we have the materials to do it. So that is a huge shift that's going on right now. I asked you to bear with me, but I wanted to give you an idea before we talk about, in particular, about one mass scale solution, that Stefan's very involved in, to give you an idea about some of the things that are happening that are top level solutions and top level glide paths to a more sustainable future if we pursue them. I hope you feel a little bit better hearing about those, and I hope also that some of them were surprising. So let's turn to what you're doing, which really blows my mind.
Okay, that was a lot, but it's good to know those solutions are out there. Let's talk about waste. It's like really fun topic. Everyone should be really excited about that. Waste, we're drowning in it, right? Everywhere you turn on planet Earth, in the oceans, there is plastic, industrial waste. And the reason we have so much waste is because we've created these open loop systems, right? In nature, something that gets used doesn't actually go to waste. There is no such thing as going to waste. It actually goes back to the earth and grows into something anew. But when we created plastic and industrial waste, we said, well, we're just going to throw that away when we're done with it. And there is no way. There's landfills, which are, as Jim said, big contributors to global warming and create a tremendous amount of methane and carbon emissions. There's incineration, incredibly dirty, very harmful for the environment. So for us, we said, okay, well, what are the solutions that exist today? Who are the players that have the technology today that can impact our waste crisis and allow us to have enough of an impact in abating the carbon related to waste and its deconstruction in landfills and its burning in incinerators, such that we can start to steer the ship. So for us, the first vertical, the first idea is, what do we do with waste? Very exciting. I could tell everyone's really excited about this. But maybe what's best is to throw up one of our videos. It talks about one of our partners called Sonova, which we believe is one of the leaders in the industry around waste treatment, around waste removal, and specifically around converting waste to something that is useful for us, clean burning energy, and with a byproduct that is not harmful to the environment, that is not toxic. We think we have found one of those solutions. We know we have found one of those solutions that can be part of the matrix of solutions that helps us get through it. So let's throw up the video and then we can talk more about waste, which is very interesting.
It's garbage day in a typical suburban neighborhood. We put out our bins, and they're taken away. It seems simple. But what we don't see is the challenge of collecting and disposing of 250 million tons of garbage each day, the equivalent of 25 billion bags of garbage. In the industrialized world, we bury our garbage, or burn it in incinerators producing dangerous dioxins and other hazardous pollutants. In the developing world, garbage is simply dumped in open pits and left to break down into methane, a greenhouse gas considered 21 times more potent than carbon dioxide, and leachate, a toxic sludge. Or it's simply dumped into rivers and the sea, where it causes catastrophic damage to the ecosystem. Globally, we're struggling to deal with this massive problem, and it's only going to get worse with municipal waste projected to double by 2025. It's clear that we need a solution. FullCycle's mission is to finance and own projects that revolutionize our relationship with waste by converting a costly environmental problem into clean, valuable fuel that can be used to power communities around the world. FullCycle Energy Fund's partner, Sonova, has created a proprietary waste-to-energy solution that efficiently transforms waste into clean and affordable energy that today is 30% more efficient than previous solutions. Here's how it works. Garbage is collected in the traditional way, but rather than being taken to a landfill or incinerator, it's taken to a Sonova plant. The waste is then sorted. Recyclables are sent to a recycling center. Inert materials like sand and stones are returned to the earth. The remaining material is processed into a feedstock and sent to the Sonova gasification unit. There, the feedstock is heated and starved of oxygen. Unlike incineration, which burns the material, this clean gasification process produces a gas that contains the high-energy molecules needed for energy production. However, the gas also contains many contaminants. Fortunately, Sonova has a unique solution for these problems. The gas is sent through a patented gas cleaning technology called Olga, pioneered by Sonova partner Royal Dahlman and the National Energy Center of the Netherlands. First, the gas is slowly spun in a mechanical cyclone. Much like a centrifuge, this separates the heavier, coarser ash particles from the gas. The remaining gas is rinsed twice. First, with a cooled scrubbing oil to remove the heavy tars, and then rinsed again with an absorbing oil to remove the light tars, leaving the remaining gas tar-free. The tars are returned to the gasifier to harness their energy, and the rinsing oils are cleaned and recirculated in the system. This highly efficient proprietary Olga gas cleaning process produces a clean-burning synthesis gas, syngas, that can be used to power electricity-generating turbines. Diverting waste from landfills means that power generated in Sonova waste conversion plants has a smaller carbon footprint than traditional fossil fuel power plants, including the cleanest natural gas power plants. If we were to process 20% of our waste into energy worldwide, we would reduce waste by over 240 million tons in 10 years and generate enough power for about 10 million U.S. households. Unlike other energy extraction schemes, Sonova's waste-to-energy technology does not put our health and the environment at risk. At FullCycle Energy Fund, we are committed to altering the business of waste and energy production to create sustainable models that are both environmentally sound and provide a high return on investment. It's time for us to invest and grow our capital by solving the world's environmental problems. It is a responsible way to meet our growing energy needs and to help protect the future of our planet. FullCycle Energy Fund. Join the solution economy.
Cool. I didn't choose the music, but it is cool.
Congratulations. You're managing director of that fund.
That's right.
How did you even, who's involved in this, and what's the mindset? Getting down to the nitty gritty of you take something that could make such a big difference as this and get it deployed out there. Has this ever been tried? Is it working anywhere?
All good questions. So FullCycle was founded by my business partner, Ibrahim Al-Husseini, who couldn't be here. He's in Los Angeles. But Ibrahim's story is compelling, and so I'll tell it for him briefly so that you can kind of understand how we as a firm are oriented. So, Ibrahim is of Palestinian descent, grew up in Saudi, came to the United States, started a few businesses, had a fair amount of success, and had the opportunity in his 20s to return back to Palestine to his favorite diving spot in the Red Sea. And what was once a teeming coral reef full of fish and all sorts of wildlife was completely dead, bleached. No more wildlife, waste and trash everywhere. And so that tenet that we have about who cares how much money you make on a planet that's dying, that comes from lived experience, not just from Ibrahim, but from the team, right? And so our orientation is laser focused on what's important here and exactly how we can take this seemingly endless and abundant supply of waste and turn it into something useful. It took years to find and develop and grow Sonova as a partner, to understand the implications of their technology. And the key word here that we mentioned earlier in the conversation, that I think we should continue to mention, is scale. So the problem is scaling. So we need to find solutions that also can scale at that rate with the problems. And this is one where we know at full deployment, waste to value and waste to energy can start to abate gigatons of carbon when in full operation. So now we're talking about a solution that can cull and change the trajectory of the problem. And that's what we're focused on. That's what we're investing in. So we're starting with waste. We have other verticals lined up: water, efficiency, sustainable building. But we want to stay true to our mission and make sure that we're finding the tech, we're growing with it, identifying it, partnering with teams and management teams that are capable, and then deploying, putting tremendous amounts of capital to work, which we'll get to in a moment, into those technologies to bring them to scale. And that's the operative word.
Now, when I get nominations for my World Technology Awards program, they range from tried and true to really compelling concepts. So that video could be a concept, or it could be something that's working right now. Is this working right now in places, and at what scale?
So it works. It is live. It is real. You can go find a Sonova plant in a couple of places around the world, knock on it, touch it, see it, feel it. So we've taken our time to prove that this is the technology that can start to have an impact. Now it's time to scale. And that's what we're focused on now. So our first fund, our first vehicle of investment will be raised so that we can take Sonova to market. It is market ready. That is what we're focused on. And then the idea is to use innovation and technology to make sure that we are positioned to be the leader and the implementer of capital solutions that have never existed before. So if I can just do a little diversion out and then back to what we're talking about.
Can you do that again?
This move. We're going to do some moves today. By show of hands, who has heard of or knows about or maybe is in the industry of blockchain and distributed ledgers? Right? I mean, unless you live under a rock, you've heard of something called Bitcoin. You know that this technology is here. If you are in industry, you know that there are applications to your field. Maybe you don't know that, but there almost are applications everywhere we go. And so one of the things we want to do is say, okay, well, in this kind of infrastructure development, how do you finance it? Typically, if you're using an efficient use of your capital, there is some component of debt or a bond. And a bond essentially says, give us capital now, we will pay you a return, and then your principal, and we assure you, and we are good for it. That's like your word is your bond. Like we're good for the payments that we'll make to you. But while we have the capital, we can put that capital to work. So essentially, it's a form of lending, but it's more official. And so a green bond essentially is a financial instrument that's tied to not just the financing element, but to what we produce or what we abate in terms of carbon and the impact we have on the environment. So one of the mechanisms that we'll put in place is not just a green bond that helps us finance our projects, but we want to use distributed ledger technology to democratize access and ownership of those bonds. What does that mean? It means when a Sonova plant goes into the ground in a community, when we go in and finance it, do our work, and then take our capital to do the next plant off the table, who should own the rest of that plant that is producing jobs, that is cleaning up the environment, that is producing clean energy, that has created infrastructure where perhaps there was no infrastructure? Our principle is that if we're going to create a new, broader, more inclusive stakeholder community of folks who own and are interested and beneficiaries of the solutions, that means you should own it. And so the simple way of doing that is to say, okay, well, how can we make this accessible to everyone? The reality is, I don't have my cell phone in my pocket, but in most parts of the world where there was not cable or telephone infrastructure, guess what everyone has in their pockets? I just told you. A cell phone. So if we can use the existing technology of today and forward look for what is possible on that very device that's in your pocket, we can then say, okay, well, is there a way for everyone to trust and know that their fractional ownership of that Sonova plant that's cleaning up their environment means that they actually are responsible for X amount of carbon that's been abated today, and for X amount of tons of waste that have been removed from their community. and ultimately for how much carbon that's been abated on a daily basis from the operations of the plant in which they are part owner. So there are scales and dimensions of grand thinking, but it's this kind of thinking that's necessary for us to attack the problem and actually start to have an impact and fund the solutions that can do so.
Yeah, it's very exciting. Yeah, exactly. It's very exciting. Full disclosure, I've known Ibrahim for a while, and not only is he a forward thinker and does he have a forward thinking team, but he's, is this on? Yeah. But he's not only, but he's a great guy, and his heart is in the right place and his mind's in the right place. So when people hear about deploying capital and getting investors involved and the fact that a project might make profit, often people, including myself, sometimes immediately are a little bit skeptical about the motives of the people. And for what it's worth, I can say that his motives are as pure as I've encountered. I also want to point out the fact that the implications of this decentralized funding model for FullCycle Energy and its partners is that it's developing a really interesting model. And when we talk about the asteroid and we talk about the 10 to 20 years, the fact is that we're going to need to speed up the transformation of the global economy. And things like this are going to speed up that transformation if people can not only buy into the concept in the conceptual sense, but actually buy in to the concept literally. So I think that's one of the reasons why I'm so excited about FullCycle, beyond the fact that it's tackling one of those problems that we need to tackle. So another reason, congratulations and thank you.
Thank you.
So I have a pivot question about capital. I just said lots of nice things about the deploying of capital, but traditional capitalism, which is capitalism can take many forms, but traditional capitalism, the kind that operates most places most of the time in recent centuries, particularly the last 50 years or so, could be argued to be the engine of our demise right now. It could be argued that the nature of capitalism is the flip side of the simple beauty of it, which is that you can borrow other people's money to do something that you want to accomplish, and then you can pay it back. It's a really simple concept. But what that does beyond the project of an individual capital project is it creates an incentive for investors to expect growth, right? You don't want just what you put in back, you want a little bit more. So capitalism at its, is this going in and out? Capitalism at its core has growth built in. And growth in a global population that's been growing, adding billions of people in recent decades, might also be argued to be driving some of the problem that we're facing right now. So my question is, do you believe that tweaking capitalism and taking new approaches, is this going in and out? Is it just me? Okay. Can I borrow yours today? And then we'll pass it back and forth. Do you believe that there's ways to tweak and ways to take a new approach that are going to help address this problem in the world that's likely going to embrace capitalism for the next 10 to 20 years? And it's too much to expect that there are many significant changes in that area.
That's a hard question. Here's what I'll say. We are already in a transition to a new economy. And that new economy is going to necessitate new participants, as I alluded to earlier. And all of the effects of climate change unabated, unattended to, unaddressed, there are many arguments you can make about the effects of those, but the most compelling, the one that people hear the most, is the economic argument. And for better or for worse, right? We are, in many ways, we are a capitalistic society, and so we hear those arguments first. But the economic effect is devastating, is potentially devastating. But I also think people need to hear the moral argument. We are one species. You are individually here, if you're lucky, for 85, 95 good years on Earth. And then hopefully you have children and they're here for even longer, and their children are here for even longer. What kind of world are we leaving behind for them? And when you look back at those 95 years, what did you do to participate in the solution? I think economic arguments are compelling because we oftentimes see everything that impacts us as directly in front of us. How much is in my savings account? What will it cost me to live tomorrow? But I think we need to shift the mindset, as you mentioned, Jim, to being longer tail, more collective thinkers about what it is we can do to be part of the solution. Yeah.
Thank you. We're going to take questions now, but to segue into that, I just want to say I hope that in a relatively short period of time, we've given you a sense of the scale of the problem, the sense of the fact that solutions and initiatives that are up to the scale of the problem are being attempted right now. There are many reasons to be despairing if we don't do what needs to be done, but some of what needs to be done is starting now, and the thinking by many people is beginning to be up to the scale of the problem. And we saw, in addition to that, an example of one project that has worked out the details of how that can be done, and that's just in one field that can make a huge impact. So I think that one thing we cannot overlook is the human potential for innovation. And also, you could argue that the human potential to react in the face of a crisis. We're not so good as a species in getting ahead of a problem, but we're really at our best. I could say, unfortunately, we're at our best when the shit hits the fan and we focus. And I think most of the world, if not the US government, but most of the world is focused on this problem. A lot of creative people in government, a lot of creative people in the nonprofit sector and civil society, and a lot of creative, well-meaning people in the world of capital markets and investments are working right now on coming up with those solutions. So on that note, let's turn to some questions. In the back there. Wait for your mic, please.
Probably don't need it, but hi, everyone. Stefan knows I think everything he does is fascinating. We're classmates from way back, but really interesting to hear all of this content. And I have a question about, my name is Lola, the personal element of things. So you guys talked about a lot of sort of aha moments for me, particularly around food waste and the impact of that. And so I just immediately started thinking about my, Plated and Blue Apron and all those sorts of things. And is that really saving? You're not wasting food, you're not throwing away, but you have the packaging. And then you start to spiral, what can I change in my life? What would you recommend as sort of a first stop for those of us who might be newer to taking stock of our activities to make those lifestyle changes as sort of a tool, something to sort of help us do that self-assessment? That's the first step to making some small incremental changes so that it's not kind of I don't know what to do, so we're not going to do anything.
Thanks, Lola. The number one thing you can do as an individual is stop eating meat. I know. Everyone likes a burger. It's tough, right? But the reality is that is actually on an individual basis, the most effective thing you can do to start to turn and contribute towards a turn away from climate change. That 15,000 liter number for that quarter pounder is a real number. I mean, it's astounding. but what plugs into it is how much it takes to grow the feedstock, the alfalfa, the cow, and all of the methane that cow will release as it lives, and then eventually the horrible and inefficient environmental process of producing that meat. But let me just put it in context, because we hear that. I think this, if you are aware of any of these issues, that might not be the first time you hear that recommendation. People, as individuals, are less than 20% of the issue. Corporations and industry and agriculture make up the broader scope of vectors into climate change and the problem. So, we need to keep our eye on that and then understand what it means to support one brand or one company versus another. So fast fashion, H&M, Uniqlo, other brands, Levi's maybe, I don't know if that's even still a brand. Terrible for the environment, right? No shade if anyone works at Levi's, wonderful jeans. But start to think about the daily impact you have just by the choices you make in the brands and companies you support. That's a bigger piece of the pie, because if the collective consumer base for a company like H&M says, wait a minute, your practices of production need to change and we'll pay more for clothes that are more sustainably produced, maybe that corporation can start to turn itself towards more sustainable practices. So there's like the immediate day-to-day, stop eating meat, be better at, composting in your pocket. That's a joke, don't compost in your pocket, that would be very smelly. And then there's the more kind of commercial choices that we make about who we support, what brands we buy, and what it means for those brands to produce more sustainably.
Thank you. I'd like to respond to your question actually in a broader way, because I think that that's also part of the solution. We need to have a easier template to decide how to face the challenges that the world has put to us in our generation right now. I believe that the question of what should I do, especially to make a difference, is the most important existential question, especially in our time, that a human being can regularly ask. I believe that the way to ask that question is to ask two questions to get to the answer. The first question is, what do I believe is right? In your heart, in your intuition, your core values, not done in an orthodox way, a closed-minded way, because we know that the what do I believe is right question in an orthodox way has led to much suffering in world history. But in an open-minded way, what do I believe is right? I think we have an internal compass, moral compass, that often can give you the answer. But you cannot only ask that question on its own. You have to pair it with the other question. What do I think is necessary? What do I believe is right, but what do I think is necessary when I look at the situation? And when you look at most situations and you analyze them, you can get an answer to that question as well. When you ask both of those questions together, you make choices that often seem, in the eyes of others, as heroic. I'll give you a very quick example. Imagine that you're walking down a street in a country lane and you look across the street. There's no one around. There's a 2-story building there. There's an 8-year-old child in the balcony. The house is caught on fire. You look around. There's no one else around. You go and you rescue the child. You're on the evening news that night, and the reporter asks, we've all seen these kind of stories, you're a hero. What were you thinking? What was going on in your head? That's amazing. And the person always says one version of the following. I had no choice. What else would I have done? I didn't have time. Because in that situation, they were forced to ask, what do I believe is right and what do I think is necessary? And when people ask those questions with clarity and they behave accordingly, we call them heroes. So the inaccessibility of the heroic, I believe, is something that we need to address, and we can address, just as we can address what we eat, just as we can address where we shop, just as we can address what we pay attention to. If we can force ourselves to make a habit of asking those two questions, what do I believe is right and what do I think is necessary, no matter what we face, then we can decide what to do when it comes to food waste. We can decide what to do when it comes to pollution. We can decide what to do when it comes to human suffering or the suffering of other living things on the planet. Because we know what's right and we know what's necessary.
Oh, hey there. I have a question about community ownership of Sonova plants. You talked about the community sharing in reduced carbon emissions and knowing that they did their part in impacting that. I'm curious if they share in profits, and what does that look like?
That's a good question. So the call to action for us, right, is to join us. Join our stakeholder community, be an interested stakeholder in the projects that we're going to put in the ground and the investments that we'll do and the campaigns that we'll run. Join us. But what we want to make sure of is, when you build a community of stakeholders, what does it actually mean? And for us, that means ownership, right? That's the number one way you have folks involved and active and participating in the solution is if they feel they own it, at least in part. So the green bond that we'll put out to help finance a lot of our projects, and then its digitization, right? So turning it to something digital that you can own a fraction of, does mean that you are a fractional owner of the asset. So as the asset produces, you earn. And that's a really important aspect to what it is that we'll do, because it does a couple of things. A, it creates a stakeholder community, but B, maybe it brings folks up from lower middle class or poverty into the investor class. That's mega impact. And at a scale at which we hope to deploy our capital, that means millions and millions of people who now are participating in something that they ordinarily would not get access to. So our call to action is to come join us, be part of our story, and participate in the ownership of the things, plural, that we'll deploy and the opportunities and the projects, rather, that we'll put in place on the ground. But to answer your question directly, owning a piece of that means owning a piece of the revenue stream. And just quickly for Sonova, the reason we love this tech and this business is that it makes money many ways. So if you hear only the economic argument, which, as I said earlier, I don't think you should just hear that, but it's what people hear, so we'll talk to it. Rarely do you find a way to produce energy in which the input is also a revenue item. That is to say, we get paid to take the waste, right? New York City pays us to take the waste. And then it pays us on a long-term contract to produce the energy. So we have many ways to make everyone who's a participator and a stakeholder money in our projects. And that to us is the key differentiator. Because now if the only thing you heard was the economic argument, we got you. We're with you, right? And you can be part of the solution. That $1 trillion per annum number is going to take everyone's involvement. And I'm not talking millionaires and billionaires. I'm talking everyone participating in the solutions and the funding of those solutions. And that's how we intend to do it.
By the way, just a quick question on that. In addition to small investors, I heard that you're doing some dinners in New York and LA coming up for mid-scale and larger investors. Is that still happening?
Yeah, that's right. So our launch into this next chapter of what FullCycle will accomplish will require us to sit with folks who are traditional investors, who are impact investors, who are infrastructure investors, who are new to this kind of investing, and tell our story. It's not a simple story, and it's not a story that, it's a story where if you hear the problem at scale, you could get scared of it and say, I don't know, I can't do anything about that, right? So what we want to do is be able to sit very much in settings like these with folks and answer all of the questions. Who are we? Why does it matter? What's the problem at hand? And most importantly, together, what can we do to solve it?
Thank you. More questions?
Hello. So in the beginning, you laid out kind of these two big problems. One is the public perception, and the second the technology and the investing. And you think so systematically about the investing part. There's kind of all these rankings and analyses and some of that you shared with us. And on the kind of the public perception side, tonight I've heard a kind of couple of perspectives. So one is kind of the economic argument for why this is good. There's kind of the moral argument. There's another argument maybe which was implicit in what I heard is just, don't worry about the public perception because it'll take care of itself because things will get so bad. Just wondering if that implicit message that I'm hearing is right, or is there a way to kind of think about the perception, public change of mind part also just as systematically as we're thinking about the investment and technology part? Is that something you think about, care about? Is there room for thinking in that way? So just curious.
A couple of weeks ago, I had a conversation, you may be watching, with a scientist who revealed himself as a climate denier. And after I picked my jaw off the floor and collected myself, I said, okay, well, if this person of science is still doubting that we are contributing to climate change in a meaningful way that is changing the trajectory and the warming of the planet, then we do have a perception problem that we need to address. I think about it constantly. I know Brahim thinks about it constantly. Our whole team is focused on that as something that we need to be part of the shift of. It's a shift of consciousness and awareness and an understanding that science is real, and that even though on an individual basis, scientific experiments don't operate by consensus, when thousands and thousands of scientists have consensus, it's because the experiments have shown that there is a reality. And we're done with the time and the shenanigans of second-guessing science, right? Whether or not you subscribe to that, there's no more room for that doubt. We don't have time. So without being an alarmist, the urgent issue demands that we laser focus on what's important, that we see science for what it is, and if we can be part of that conversation and that shift in consciousness, despite the best efforts of some people we know in positions of power, we have to do that. Right, that's really important, and it's important for the economic argument. It's important for the social argument. It's important for the moral argument that we have to make about what we need to do.
I want to make clear that what I was saying was not a sense of it's going to work itself out, or that the problems are going to cause people to respond, and we just have to wait for the problems. There will be as much innovation, I believe, in the messaging and storytelling related to climate change and the environment as there will be innovation in the technology. I'm just saying that's going to play itself out, that it's going to it has an incentive, and the incentive in part will be the fact that it's fortunately or unfortunately, it's an incredible story, and that story is very compelling. And it's going to become increasingly compelling as more things happen, good or bad. So I think that is going to happen, and I'm not saying we should just assume it's going to work itself out. I think that it will play itself out because there's going to be as much innovation in that field. But there's a bigger point, which is that just as the democratized, do it again? Just as the democratized financing mechanisms that you talked about for FullCycle are, I think, going to be an interesting model that can be adapted to other initiatives. I think we're going to see some interesting ripple effects from some of the progress on certain projects that begin to show traction early on. In a world without hope, examples of solutions working are going to be very, very attractive to people. People are hungry for hope. They're hungry for hope in their political messages. They're hungry for hope in their cultural messages and gatherings and community. They're hungry for hope right now, and they're hungry for hope directly proportional to the amount of despair that they feel. So some of these good stories are going to start to gain traction. And I believe that's going to drive further storytelling. But I also believe it's going to have spread to other fields. So people, once they have hope, are going to begin to innovate more themselves. They're going to realize that it's worth it for human civilization to get out of bed in the morning and try to kick some ass again.
Hello. Hi, I was first. Hi, my name is Irina, and I'm currently working at the organization that's called CDP, and it's a global disclosure platform that engages corporations, states, and regions to disclose their environmental data. And basically, it's acting through the investors by investors requesting their companies or companies that are interested in the money to disclose their environmental data and risks and all of that. So my question is about the details on the structure to finance the plant, the waste energy plant. And I'm curious about what you guys are thinking about how to draw the boundaries for the community to be responsible to finance the waste that potentially is coming from completely different communities. And it's we all know that the U.S. is sending the waste to all other poor countries, and of course those countries wouldn't be happy to just pick up the tab for the U.S. But also, of course, we send that domestically too. So we don't want people in the Bronx to pay for the trash that's produced by people on Park Avenue. So how do you draw the boundary? How do you track that trash? It's incredibly difficult. And another thing is that I was amazed with the technology of Sonova. And I know that plastics are they have the highest caloric value to produce the most energy. So if all of that is recycled, so how do you really sustain? How do you produce enough energy to run the plant? And another question is how many houses can be powered by this one plant if the plastics are recycled, which is ideal, without burning it. So that should be it. Thank you.
That's it? Okay, I'll answer in order. Very simply, the stakeholder community that we're building is global, and it's to finance plants that we will put on the ground all over the world. And the vectors that determine where we go first, but not necessarily where we go full stop, are how much it costs for us, or how much we essentially take in terms of revenue to bring in the trash, how much it costs, or rather the price of power that we produce. And the third intangible is how much impact can we have on the ground in that community. But we don't draw lines, around a community that will have impact or that will be responsible for financing plants. We take in that contribution, that capital, and then we determine where it gets deployed globally. Your second question was about technology. So Sonova's tech is innovative, it's patented, it's wonderful, it's not new. So gasification has been around for some time. It's a technology that's typically used in resource industries. Sonova was just really good at taking it, flipping it around 180 degrees, turning it on its head, using it for a different purpose. But as you correctly stated, the highest caloric, meaning what burns best for us, is actually plastic. Thank God we're drowning in it. Thank God the Pacific Ocean patch of plastic is 150 feet deep and the size of Texas. Like, there's no shortage of waste. What gets recycled is glass and metal, and then what gets returned to the earth are sand and dirt and things that are from the earth. So that's your second question. And with all that, I've forgotten your third question. I'm very sorry. Okay. Yeah, so we actually don't participate in the sending of trash from here to Thailand. Interestingly, recycling, everyone should recycle. I hope you all have a blue bin at home and you put all your recyclables away. But unfortunately, what happens in a lot of municipalities is all that gets collected and it gets shipped off to China. And China throws it into an incinerator or puts it in a landfill. So it pains me to say that. It's not a nice reality to identify and understand, but recycling today has had mixed effects. But what is just an interesting factoid that participates and is a vector into our business is that China has closed its doors to the world's trash. And so all over the world, every country, every government, every municipality is freaking out. What are we going to do with all of this waste? We have 3 years of landfill left, right? So there is an urgency, there's a moment in time, but there's also a solution that's come right at the right moment in time to be able to capture all of that value and actually produce something both of value and that takes the negative externalities of all that waste out of our cycle and out of our ecosystem.
Before we go to a question, I want to ask a follow-up question about pricing. You mentioned pricing before. Are you able to explain a little bit about this idea of carbon pricing? This thing that has been demanded by many people who argue that pricing carbon would be the single greater than anything else on the list that I gave, contributor because it would affect everything else, including your business. So what is carbon pricing and is it going to happen and how does it work?
So I don't know if it will happen. Not prescient, but what I can say is carbon pricing is simply the practice of attaching a dollar value per unit of carbon that is emitted, right? So if you are a carbon emitter, regardless of what you're doing, there's a cost to producing that carbon. You've got to pay that cost. And so now the choices and the inputs into any business practice change by virtue of that line item that is now a cost that was not something that was considered before. For us, we say, look, a Sonova plant, after a bit of time running, actually supplies itself its own power. And by virtue of the waste that it's removing from the environment and the clean energy that it's producing, it actually is carbon negative. And if the feedstock, the input into the Sonova plant is something like biomass, it is functionally renewable in every capacity. That's really powerful. And so the last piece for us is, okay, well, what does it mean for us to carbon capture at the tail end when we're producing energy? And if that's a cost item, if that's something that we can capture as a revenue stream, then it's even more profitable for us to operate our plants. Will it happen? I do not know. There are certain governmental factors in place and intergovernmental factors in place that will impact that conversation. I'm hopeful that it will happen, because it will determine and will be a determining factor for major industry, for agriculture, and for consumers at the tail end into what we spend our money on and what we value in the full equation of what it takes to, for instance, eat a burger or produce a t-shirt.
Hi, thank you both for talking to us today. This has been really illuminating. My question is actually about the funding mechanism, and I'm curious about the decision to go with the green bonds versus maybe like what's something that I think is more established in the lexicon, which is like the credits, like the actual credits for offsetting carbon emissions. And then also on the back end, it seems like you guys have chosen to go with blockchain technology, which is really exciting. And I think I understand the benefits in that it provides a lower threshold of entry. It's like getting the new hands involved and providing that access. But just thinking about where we are in terms of that technology being widely adopted and how differently nations are currently thinking about it. What are some of the risks involved in going with that model, understanding that there are obvious benefits to all of us in getting involved and being able to have access to that technology?
Thank you. So I'll say this, in some ways we are a bleeding edge, innovative company focused on investing in bleeding edge technology and being tech enabled. And I'll say bleeding edge one more time because it's cool. In other ways, we are a bog standard investment firm investing in infrastructure. And in that realm, the most efficient way to deploy capital is to put equity capital in and is to finance or fund via debt instruments the rest of the cost of constructing those projects. Very similar to if you've got a mortgage at home, you didn't buy your house for $100,000 cash, you put $10,000 down or $20,000 down and you finance the rest. Very similar mechanism. So that's essentially the bonding that takes place to finance. In terms of the blockchain element of it, we're lucky that we don't need this sector, this industry to start what we're doing, right? Our first thing is let's get started bringing projects to bear, plants in the ground, and let the universe of tech around blockchain both get widely adopted and be evolved to be more integral than it already is. You may not see it today, but if you did some online banking on your phone, odds are you're working with a company that is racing, like Wells Fargo or JP Morgan, racing to adopt this technology and use it because it's so good. And it is so promising for what it can accomplish in terms of liquidity, transferability, immutability, and trust. I mentioned a couple of financial institutions, and they obviously are necessary parts of our economy, but every single financial institution that holds all of your money has failed you in the sense that it sold or lost your data, right? Who here has had their identity stolen, has a lock on their credit, and has had to get one of those letters, and it's very annoying and very upsetting. So that is a side use case, but a very applicable one for the technology and its promise. So we're here just to let it evolve, let it grow, and let it become more established and widely adopted, as you say. And then by that point, we know we'll be ready to implement it and apply it to the tech, but we don't need it to get started. And that's a really key point, is that we're out here now. We're going to kick off in January as is and know that we can operate as a bog standard infrastructure investment firm, but we always have our eye focused on technology and innovation because that's what's going to allow us to scale. And that's the operative word here.
I just wanted to add that I am a noted or unnoted blockchain skeptic. And I'm not a blockchain skeptic in the mid and long term. I'm a blockchain skeptic in the immediate term. I do believe there's some great applications for blockchain, and what you're trying to do to finance this is not only interesting because it's a great application for FullCycle, but it's a great application that I think would be a good model for other initiatives when we're going to have to come up with way more than $1 trillion a year to solve this global climate crisis. So, like you said, this is an incredible mass scale project that is not dependent upon that innovation. Unlike many blockchain related companies, this is not a blockchain related company. It's a company that also thinks it can do a lot extra if blockchain is able to be deployed and work in that particular way. But this project is not about that, and I'm supportive of this project and would be in and of itself, because it is what we've been talking about tonight. We've been talking about solutions that are up to the scale of the problem. And probably, even if you've been familiar with the field, you walked in here tonight interested because you wanted to have not only some more knowledge, but some more hope. And I believe that part of what we've accomplished, if we've accomplished anything this evening, is to add a little information and a little bit of hope to you and learn about a project that you may want to get involved in. So on that note, we're going to wrap up, and we're all here available to talk to you and answer any questions, or just to say hello or give a typical assemblage style hug. So thank you so much. And thank you. And thank you, Assemblage.